Do I remember my parents or grandparents talking about the war?
I can remember him telling me a story about
the First World War.
My granddad and the sergeant,
they were effectively hunting these guys down.
went and threw a grenade in the tent.
Well,
Welcome back to No Ordinary Life, where ordinary people like Gavin,
Okay.
Julie, Anne, Andy,
Push that back.
April,
Okay.
Susanna,
it's really funny.
Spencer, Sarah, and B
I'm just painting pictures.
talk about their extraordinary lives.
Did they talk about the war?
About the First World War.
Not really.
Not really. I mean, I was young
Well,
when my grandparents all had passed away.
probably more to my sister, who had more to do with them in later years than I.
Contrary to what an awful lot of people have found,
I wouldn't really have been aware of the war, I think, very much then.
they didn't want to talk about the war
Leave all your comments below.
because it brought back very bad memories.
But he did tell us, how when the First World War broke out
Did my parents talk about the war?
and they were on a boat that had some German people on the boat.
Not a great deal, but later,
Very clearly, I can remember one story he told us about how
when my father was much older,
this German gentleman held my mother, who was a small child, over the edge of the boat,
did ask him some direct questions.
which terrified my grandmother.
He was a template worker.
He was only joking, I think, but anyway, she came back. She was alive and well and kicking.
Did not get called up immediately because he was in one of those reserved occupations.
They talk about the World War. I don't
And he was an air raid warden for the village.
think they have, to me.
And I do remember him telling me one story where he was walking up the road
But if I can remember, they're just talking about
and some incendiary bombs landed in the village. I think they must have been jettisoned by a German bomber that was returning from raiding Swansea docks.
communists.
A couple of these bombs went through the roof of a house and ignited the house.
But I don't think the World War will come to my head, never.
I remember my father telling me that him and another warden were there.
I don't even know the war, when I was a child.
So he dashed into the house, up the stairs to the loft,
What I can hear before, they would just say about
turned around for his mate's assistance,
somebody communist and something like that,
discovered his mate had scarpered it.
not really come in any concern or like equation in my head at all.
In a way, I think he acted very heroically that day.
My father
They would never, for instance,
was a recognised pacifist.
look at war films on the television
He was a Jehovah's Witness.
because they didn't want to be reminded.
He endorsed peace,
I think they felt that war was always
multiculturalism,
glorified,
all of the nice things,
whereas in reality,
human rights, civil rights. He was a really nice guy.
it could have been very, very much different.
I don't say this. I think everyone says that their father was the greatest guy that ever lived. Well, mine was too.
Stay tuned.
My grandmother always said I was the cause of the war.
My grandfather apparently was on the guns.
And taken prisoner in World War II.
A prisoner of war breakout.
I think it was in Africa.
And I can remember when they bombed Harrods,
And one of the people had been killed.
the impact shook our house.
Could quite easily, I guess, have just...
The conversation continues.
Did either of my grandparents talk about the war and have any stories?
My grandmother always said I was the cause of the war.
Yes. My mum's mum always told me about like tuppence and shillings.
Being born in July and then war broke out in September.
It was so cheap back then.
I can remember quite a bit about the war, actually.
The world was a better place.
We lived in Chelsea in Poulton Square. We had a huge house.
She could walk around freely.
And I can remember when they bombed Harrods.
growing up now is completely different.
The impact shook our house.
I think the main stories
My sister was in a Moses basket underneath the kitchen table.
was the fact that her mum used to work in a factory
I was with Nanny in the kitchen. I remember things falling off the shelves.
and make,
I also remember Mother and Father
I think it was bottle caps
going down to Lots Road when they bombed Lots Road
for the actual bottles.
and helping to pull out the people who were drowning in the basement cellars
For the milk or something like that.
where they'd gone for safety because the boilers were hit and they flooded. It was an awful thing, you know.
But those are the only stories I remember.
And I think it affected both of them quite badly.
It was a very long time ago though.
And then my mother and I were evacuated.
Share your story with us.
Do I remember my parents or grandparents talking about the war?
He did get called up.
When I was at high school,
He didn't go abroad.
I had to do a history project.
Served with the South Wales Borderers in training camps,
So I knew at the time that my grandfather
training riflemen.
was in the Korean War.
So he must have been a very good shot himself.
So I spoke to him about that.
And I think he was involved in the great prisoner of war breakout from the island camp in Bridgend.
Did my history project on his experiences in the Korean War.
I can remember him telling me a story.
Recently, my mother and I spoke about this.
They were effectively hunting these guys down.
He didn't really talk about it
It was winter time and it was snowing.
with his children.
And these guys had like red discs
Maybe because I was coming to him
back of their jackets or their overalls.
asking specifically because it was a history project, he gave me a little bit more information.
We said it was quite easy to spot them.
He was a
Could quite easily, I guess, have just
communications officer.
shot them down.
So he did lots of running lines between different camps.
But they didn't.
Don't remember him talking much about actually seeing any combat.
And he said very quickly they were
And while he did talk a little bit more to me about it, it was still
queuing up
clearly didn't want to talk too much
to be readmitted into the camp
or reminisce that much about the experience.
because it was impossible for them to survive in those conditions.
My parents were both born in
So my grandfather, my dad's dad,
1944 and 45.
I was very close to.
Didn't really see the war, so they didn't have any stories.
I used to take him shopping every Friday,
But we did have my Uncle Vic
especially when my grandma couldn't really go out anymore
was in the RAF,
because she got dementia.
though I never met him.
So I'd go and spend time with my granddad, take him shopping.
He wrote a story about being shot down
And then the deal was that he'd then take me for a couple of pints afterwards.
and taken prisoner in World War II, which was quite fascinating.
So every Friday afternoon, we'd run around the shop in about 10 minutes
I remember all of it at the moment, but yeah, that was absolutely fascinating to hear.
and then straight to the Weatherspoons, have a couple of pints.
But how his plane was shot down, he survived,
And my grandfather used to open up to me quite a lot.
but he was taken as a prisoner of war, and obviously he survived that as well.
And he did tell me several stories about the war.
Don't miss an episode. Subscribe.
I don't know how much detail to go into about this.
My mother and I were evacuated
My grandfather apparently was on the guns
to Snitterfield,
for about 4 days solid.
a farm. I remember chickens. I love chickens to this day.
Because one of the people on the vehicle,
And I can remember my mother saying that they were that
they would have 3 people all together,
close they could see when Coventry Cathedral was bombed,
and one of the people had been killed.
and they saw the flames.
So there was only 2 of them. One had to drive and one had to be on the gun constantly.
She then went and decided that we'd go back to London because she wanted to do war work,
I think it was in Africa.
which she did, entertaining the troops.
After being on the guns for this amount of time,
She did things in Trafalgar Square,
when they got back to the army base,
reading poetry, etc., along with Dame Myra Hess, who played the piano, etc.
the sergeant who was normally there wasn't there.
And shortly after that,
And the second in command, who didn't like my granddad,
we were evacuated down to Milford-on-Sea to friends of my mother who'd been at school with her.
said that they had to go to a quiz night that evening.
Then there was the big upheaval of mother and father separating and father disappearing.
To which my granddad replied, "I'm not going to no quiz night, I'm going to bed. I've been on the guns for 4 days solid. I'm going to bed, F off."
And the next thing we knew, we were at the orphanage.
So my granddad didn't go to the quiz night.
Judy and I.
So the second in command locked the two of them up in a cellar.
And that's where we went.
With no food and no drink.
Mother didn't even kiss us goodbye.
And then when the main sergeant actually returned, he asked where Herbert was. That's my granddad's name.
It's embarked very clear. I can't remember her actually leaving us.
People told them what had happened.
My sister, who's younger, she can remember her just leaving us on the steps.
He immediately went and released them from this cellar they'd been locked in.
And getting back in the taxi and driving off.
And
I can't remember any of that. I must have blacked it out.
That evening, my granddad and the sergeant went and threw a grenade in the tent.
But anyway, we were there, and that's where we stayed.
Luckily, he wasn't in there, but yeah, that's one of the main stories I remember him telling me.
Next time.
If someone was to ask me
as a man
what was expected of me as a man
during my formative years
within my community,
I became a man in the 1970s.
As a man,
how do you define a man?
It will come down to
No Ordinary Life. Thank you for watching.
Do I believe in forgiveness and why? Yes, I do believe in forgiveness. I don't think it's always easy. Yes, it's important to forgive people because pointless holding on to things that you can't change.
Subscribe to keep the conversation going and don't forget to ring the bell.